Thank you very much, and I'm truly honored and privileged to be here and to receive this distinction. But I would like to start by cautioning that I believe that one should not waste an opportunity like this. That I would rather challenge with respect and without offending than just simply leave the event go unnoticed, I mean, in our busy lives and so on. So I will be saying things which I hope are not intended to offend, and I hope nobody will take offense. I am from Sudan, and I think you will see that that is reflected in almost everything I do, including, I hope, this presentation. Creativity in later life. And for those who may have seen a title, I have a subtitle to say, Prospects of Epistemological Self-Determination. Because the challenge for me is not just simply, and please, if you can't hear me or I'm not coherent enough, I should, by the way, explain that I had a knee replacement surgery about 4 weeks ago. So any incoherence is the fault of my, is the fault of my knee, whereas every coherence is my credit, okay? If you can't hear me or make what I'm saying, please wave or something that I can try to speak more clearly. So I'm saying that the notion of self-determination I introduced in the subtitle to indicate that there are many ways in which our creativity is inhibited. And sometimes, actually, for even the most privileged of us, remains inhibited all our lives. So it is not something that we take for granted, or something that the young has some monopoly over. Because in fact, given the understanding of the global diversity of cultures and traditions, creativity is in fact more expected and more respected from the elder rather than from the younger. In Islamic and African cultures, in Jewish culture, I expect also, to my understanding, respect is given to age and to life experience. And therefore, those who speak with that authority may enjoy more creativity understood more broadly than those who are young, and we, at this age or time of our lives, tend to think of as rash or immature. I don't mean to offend those of us who are young, but you know what I mean. Now, there is an interesting coincidence that Saturday was the day I became 73 years old. So I am more or less qualified to be on that side of the table. And the reason I know it is a Saturday, because when I was born, there was no birth certificates or registration in Sudan, where I came from. But my mother remembered the day by remembering a time of a train that came by our village. And that train came like 5 in the morning on a Saturday. She said when that train came by, she knew it was April, and she said it was that time of day. The reason I mention this is not only that it was only day before yesterday, but that same day before yesterday, April 6th, is an event in Sudan that will stand in our memory for life. When Sudan has been, for some of you who may be following foreign news, quote unquote, that Sudan has been in turmoil for many years, but there have been a very promising and exciting development of popular resistance to oppression and authoritarianism that has broken out into sort of demonstrations for almost 3 months now. But April 6th was the day that the leadership of the opposition or the protest called on people to come out in mass. They said, we want to have 1 million demonstrators on the streets of Khartoum. And since we stayed overnight to watch, do you mind if I get my water? I tend to, oh, it's okay, I can get it. So they called on people to come out because al-Bashir refused to relinquish power despite demonstrations every day for the last 3 months. So this time, and we watched it, and thanks to technology now, some people who were taking pictures from the concentrations of the demonstration around Khartoum city captured massive numbers of people. Of course, we like the figure 1 million, you know, the 1 million man march, the 1 million this and that. So Sudanese were hoping for 1 million. I don't know if you made the 1 million, but we made the most impressive and powerful demonstration in Sudanese history. We are not known for our active engagement in political demonstrations, but this one was really exceptional. So the reason I mention this is that in my speaking of creativity and self-determination, this is what I mean. I mean the ability of human beings to be creative in expressing themselves, in asserting their self-determination, no matter what, under the most harsh and the most oppressive conditions. And that we should be grateful, those of us who are privileged to be able to speak of this or to live by this. But for those who are not, in fact, the privilege is ours more because of the price we pay for our creativity. It is not something that we take for granted. It is not something that we can assume that all of us can do, and it is a sense of humility that brings us to appreciate the value of this notion of creativity. In this, actually to Gary, I said that I will introduce myself somewhat. And I think I do this again because it is relevant to what I'm going to say subsequently. As I said, I was born on April 6, 1946. But also that day, as I was saying, is also an event in which that marked modern Sudanese history. But like 25 years ago, in April 6, 1985, our previous dictatorship was overthrown. That of Jafar Numeri, the one who introduced Sharia by decree in Sudan in 1983. So Numeri was overthrown on April 6, and that's why people are coming out on this April 6, hoping that al-Bashir will be overthrown in April 6. But at least I think they have triggered by their creativity in organizing, because organizing a massive demonstration is extremely difficult and dangerous under conditions of repressive regimes like that of al-Bashir. And many people have been killed in these demonstrations, but people still keep coming back. Even when they were being shot at, even on the 6th of April, still people stayed foot and did not run away or go home. To me, that is a level of creativity that we should honor and respect. But my personal note goes to say that also that because of my age and circumstances of my birth, I am what you may call an African post-colonial lawyer. I was born in 1946. The British and Egyptian rule of Sudan ended in 1956, 10 years later. So I was already 10 years old when colonial rule left Sudan. But unfortunately, they have not left yet. Or rather, they may have acquired a new garb, a new look. Now they look like us. They have the same color, same accent, but they are as colonial as the previous colonial administrations have been. And that's why I'm saying that the question of how my life on path reflects the challenge of creativity under the conditions that I'm referring to. Of course, you heard the degrees. I mean, it's always very impressive, especially when the name of Cambridge is dropped in the introduction. But it's really, I'm not ungrateful to the experiences that I had in the United Kingdom, in Britain, in from between 1971 to 76. Because it was an occasion that gave me an introduction to a very profound understanding of the fields that I work in, law, human rights, criminology, and so on, and also comparative law in Edinburgh. But also that it is an indication that when Sudan became independent, like almost all African countries, we remain colonized in our own minds. And that's what I mean about how colonialism can dominate and inhibit our creativity, as all oppressions does. When I came back to Sudan in 1976, I started teaching at the University of Khartoum for about 10 years. But in those 10 years, I spent almost 2 years in prison in Sudan because I was part of a movement that was opposed to the modern application of Sharia by the state. So in that sense, I'm not claiming credit for that, but it explains the rest of my life. That's what I have done with my life is due to the fact that I was part of that movement. And that movement was started by people who had really very little resistance or protection against the extremely oppressive condition that they faced. The nature of our recent, or Sudan, when I say our, I mean Sudan, although at this point I am an American citizen. I am honored and privileged by that, but I remain Sudanese. And I remain an African. And that in our lives, in our experiences, we have endured and continue to endure varieties of, as I said, inhibition of our creativity. In our case, it is not just simply political and material conditions or economic standards or development and all of the difficulties that other societies face, but also the constant threat of Sharia being enforced as the law of the state. People may not realize, and actually most of the Americans who are sort of upset and sometimes, I would say with due respect, disproportionately fear of Sharia or fear of what it might do, what if we got ruled by Sharia. That's not going to happen in this country. It is a totally misplaced apprehension. But there is stronger apprehension for how that might affect all our lives, regardless of where we live. And that's why the cause of resisting the enforcement of Sharia by the state is universal, is global, and not just simply for Muslims alone. But definitely Muslims have the primary cause of response and challenge. Here I come to maybe some aspect of the conversation that you may have expected, which is the question of creativity and what I would call almost like the paradox of it, or the tension, the dilemma that the notion of creativity presents. Because we are all academics, we are all sort of identify with certain disciplines, and we have our gatekeepers of those disciplines who control what is published and what is not published, and what is taught and what is not taught. And I think the idea of creativity is something about challenging those norms and institutions. But how to do that without undermining the integrity of the traditions and the disciplines that we identify with? That is a dilemma that I am speaking of. In my case, of course, I was fortunate that I came from a place under conditions that I had no choice but to break those boundaries. And I was fortunate enough, maybe because of the novelty of what I represent, or because people often are curious. I mean, what is this person saying? Where does it come from? Really, is this Kant you are talking about? With all due respect, it's not. It's actually have nothing to do with Kant. But it has everything to do with profoundly humane and humanitarian traditions. of Muslim and Islamic civilizations for centuries. And therefore, for me, the gatekeepers are those who keep those gates of tradition and creativity mutually inclusive and open to each other, so that the passage of the tradition comes across minds which are creative and lives which are creative. And that's how the tradition remains a tradition. So in my case, I had no choice because I had to challenge ideas about Sharia, which ultimately, actually, fortunately, probably, I have found to be really totally human. There is nothing sacred about Sharia. It is not divine. It's a human understanding of what Muslims believe to be divine, which is the Quran and Sunnah of the Prophet, or Hadith. But it is not the corpus of norms and institutions that we call Sharia are not divine per se. They are not divine in themselves, but they create conditions where there is reverence for the tradition and keeping the boundaries of social life in a way that makes continuity of that tradition possible. But we should really balance our commitment to that. And therefore, I am challenged, or I am required to challenge those premises and institutions, but I am also challenged to do so in a way that does not undermine their integrity. Because that is the field that I have to operate in. If I want to be persuasive, I have to use language and be respectful enough that people take me seriously. By people, I don't mean, with all due respect, people in this room, but the people who were on Sudan, Khartoum's streets 2 nights ago. Those are the people who need to be reassured that in challenging a so-called Islamic regime, they are not challenging Islam. And to challenging pretenses and claims of enforcement of Sharia by the state, they are not challenging Sharia itself as a norm that Muslims revere. But it is just simply a political exercise by particular political forces that need to be challenged and defeated, and kept defeated. So here it comes that, again, that balance between, or the need to create sufficiently powerful arguments that are from within the tradition itself, that can be persuasive to members of that tradition, without accepting the assumptions about the nature of that tradition as being sacred or permanent. So it is the need to remain relevant, but to a particular constituency, which may not necessarily be the academic constituency. But fortunately for me, I mean, the reason I have found a home in Emory is because I have enough credibility at that point, at least, to be taken seriously by my colleagues at Emory Law School, and also at Emory Department of Religion, Study of Religion, GDR. I always wondered about the GDR of the Department of Religion, because you know GDR was East Germany. And so it is, and also Candler with some colleagues and students constantly. So I have been accepted and admitted into membership of communities that are academic, that remain profoundly academic, but were creative enough in their own minds and hearts that they are willing to listen to different understanding and experiences, like the ones that I was trying to introduce. The problem I have with academia is this, what I call myth of academic neutrality. Of course, no human beings can be neutral, period. No human being can be neutral. Therefore, let us examine what we mean by neutrality, and in what respect is it to be accepted, and what respect is it to be challenged and rejected. I have an expression that sometimes I use, is that not to take a position is in fact a position in favor of the status quo. That is, whenever you live, whatever is going on, to pretend that you stand high and dry and that you do not engage in contesting and challenging ideas and dominant policies and practices of your community and your state, you think that may be academically neutral. But I say that is, in fact, it is taking a position, but it is a position in favor of the status quo. So if you want to know and accept that you are standing in defense of the status quo, well, let that be, but let that be clearly and not confused with a notion of neutrality that takes you above or beyond the challenge of current conditions and situations. And of course, one can mention many examples of this. But the point for me is therefore a point about it is not accepting the status quo, but it is not challenging it in a way that undermines the ability of that challenge to be taken seriously, which is the point I was making earlier. I noticed that there was some laughter around the room when I said the myth of academic neutrality. But I am sure that there are many ways in which this is not the case and not true, but still, this is what we have to wrestle with. Now I will move to a little bit of an applied sort of presentation of what I'm talking about. And again, I hope that it is seen to be an effort to remain relevant and to remain credible in my own constituencies. And that should I be in the right communities elsewhere, that will be respected and accepted by my colleagues. If that does not happen to be the case, and maybe that's why I ended up in the United States rather than somewhere else, when I was, as I will explain in a few minutes, when I left Sudan the first time in 1985, we'll see that you have something here to cherish, but it is something that you have to guard very jealously. And that if you take it for granted, you will lose it. And that is the nature of human history and society. There has never been a society or a civilization so-called, or an empire so-called, that lasted forever. It does not happen. As a believer, of course, nothing is forever, I believe. But in any case, you have the lessons of history to draw on, and to look back at that history and understand that every society, every civilization that remained only to the extent that it remained true to its values. And that when it failed to do so, by taking those values more sort of casually or for granted, the sooner it will lose whatever distinction and value and achievement that it has made. In going back to Sudan 1976, if you recall, when I mentioned that earlier, I was going back into being a part of a movement in Sudan that I was part of as a law student already, that was challenging this notion of the modern application of Sharia by the state. And of course, I mean, the terms in Islamic theology and jurisprudence are put in very different language, but more or less, this is what it will be understood today to mean. So when I went back, I was back as a lecturer at the University of Khartoum, law department, but also at the same time, I was part of this movement on the streets of the cities of Sudan and northern Sudan, traveling north, east, south, west, presenting the ideas of the founder of that movement, who was presenting a radically challenging interpretation of the way Sharia has evolved historically and how it has to be shifted to a different level of understanding. So his point was that it is not only just simply challenging standard aspects of Sharia, in particular of questions as familiar with us in this room, the rights of women, freedom of religion, questions of the punishments and what they mean. It is not that. it is a question of lifting the paradigm or shifting the paradigm in a way that makes those unattainable or sustainable principles and norms really just simply turned on their head. Because if you don't, you'll slide back into them. In many Muslim majority countries across North Africa and all the way to Southeast Asia and some respect Central Asia, that people have thought that they can get away with a challenge of the dominance of Sharia or discourse, traditional discourse of Islamic jurisprudence without really upsetting anybody, without really challenging the existing power relations in their societies. And with all due respect, that does not work, whether there or here or anywhere else. That part of the ability to challenge is to be willing to live that challenge in actual encounters with the powers that be, which will use their power to smash any opposition or doubt in their integrity and their ability to control people's lives. Because that is really what it's about. It's not about the Sharia as the will of God, or it is not a question about piety or about religious integrity. It's a question about power and power relations in our societies, among the rich and poor, among men and women, among old and young, and so on. So I was fortunate to be part of that movement, and I joined. And here I think if I was at that point speaking about those issues in my academic writings, I'm sure that my senior colleagues would not, the gatekeepers, would not have lifted the gates for my publications to go anywhere. But at that time, I was submissive to the dominant discourse of in post-colonial societies who are trying to live by the remnants of civilized legal systems that colonial administration has left in our societies. So there was a belief that all we have to do is just keep it going. And the same sort of Sudan became independent in 1956, and we had English common law as the dominant law, legal tradition of Sudan, certain institutions, certain public functions, and that all we have to do is to keep these institutions going as much as we can, as closely as they were run by the British before they left. It never occurred to us that, in fact, our task was absolutely the opposite. That we were charged as post-colonial African lawyers with rethinking what African law is. In fact, what law is. And here is an example I would like to present in terms of that creativity, which may be hopefully challenging enough that it might invoke or evoke resistance. That in our sort of rush and eagerness to look as civilized as our colonial administrations have been, we dressed similar style. Even some of us sort of went to court in tails and wigs in the heat of African sun. Can you imagine? And I still do some places. I wouldn't mention names, but it is because there is a very deep-rooted inhibition that this is the way to go. The British way to go is the best way to go, and we better keep it as it is or as much as it is, or has been left for us by the British. But in fact, the challenge is the opposite. But for me personally, it never occurred to me that there was a different way or another way for many years to come. So one dimension or aspect of the work that I think in my own life represents the creativity that I long for and seek to affiliate with. On the other hand, also I have aspects which engage my professional so-called, my legal training and professional standing as an academic in post-colonial British somewhat legal traditions that I had to uphold. Part of what my charge is about human rights. And particularly the question of what does the universality of human rights mean? Who defines it for whom? Who applies or practices that? The term human rights really had acquired a mythical dimension of influence and power over our minds and hearts. As soon as it is mentioned, our minds freeze. And we are no longer willing to challenge or talk about anything else. And so simply, oh, it said it is human rights, or said that regime is violating human rights. It said this organization is upholding human rights. But why should that be the case? How is that the case? And how are human rights universal if they are protected only by the northern-based organizations, funded by northern-based businesses, in order to uphold northern, by northern, of course you understand me, I mean the former colonial powers. Europe and the United States and Canada, of course, was itself a colonized entity at that point in time. The point I'm making here is that we have to be willing to challenge even the very premise that universality of human rights have been established by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights may have been a beginning, but by no means is it the end or ultimately the definition of what universality means. Because most of humanity was absent from the site of the negotiation and adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At this point in time, there are 53 African members or members of the United Nations from Africa. And I also about the African Union, about that number of figure of states. At the time the Universal Declaration was drafted, there were only 4 states from the entire continent of Africa who were members of the United Nations. And those were Egypt, Liberia, Ethiopia, and South Africa. And you can imagine, of course, there is a shadow of doubt on the integrity and representativeness of those regimes of their own populations. But the rest of African people in whose name the Universal Declaration was being proclaimed had no say whatsoever. Not even a comma. Not even the honor of listening to these drafts being read out in the General Assembly for adoption or rejection or amendment. And you know what? The reason why Africans were kept out was even more outrageous. According to international law, colonial powers control the sovereignty of the colonized peoples. That is, Africa was assumed to be a total sovereignty vacuum, totally open for prize, for up for grabs, as the expression goes. The Berlin Conference of 1895, 85, 86, I think, which divided up Africa into regions of influence among European colonial powers, so that they don't engage in competing with each other in their quest for control of African resources, African peoples. So it was just a purely traffic exercise. Like have a traffic light here, have a stop sign over there, the French end here and the British take over until the Indian Ocean here and so on. But in terms of who are the people who live there and what their lives are like, that was not part of the conversation. And so the idea that I don't have the standing to attend the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights because my sovereignty has been stolen by European powers who are drafting the same Universal Declaration in Paris and adopting it to be approved by the General Assembly. So the idea that sovereignty can be like this, something that I will take it from you and pass it on to that, But it has nothing to do with you. It is not your life. It is not your self-determination. It is not your right to health care, to education, to all the goods that you need to have to live a decent human life. So therefore, there are very profound doubts about the claim of universality of human rights in that way. But for me to have said that, when I was coming out of the University of Edinburgh, when I went back to Sudan to teach, would have been heretical, and would have also meant that the gatekeepers would not have allowed. Even now, almost 50 years later, still, or 40 years later, still, it is a struggle to begin that conversation and have people listen to what you are saying seriously. The point is that the challenge is not to the idea of human rights or universal. It is not that, or that the universality of human rights is a social and political good for human societies to have. It's just simply about who speaks for them, who defines them, who implements them. And if it is not in the entire humanity that is part of that, then the outcome is not universal. Just simply logically, it does not stand to reason that you claim that standards that have been drafted by 50 members of the United Nations, dominated by, of course, the major powers and former colonial powers, defined human rights for eternity and for universality of human rights everywhere. That cannot be. It is simply not coherent to claim that. But we have to challenge it still, because we invest in the universality of human rights, not that because we seek to abandon it. It is because I take it seriously that I have to speak out against the dominant culture and voice. And of course, what I speak and what I have said all these years since the early 1980s now goes on. I mean, you can find it at Emory. I was even able to start a website in which more than 70 articles and book chapters are open to download without charge. They are downloaded every day all over the world. That's a privilege I came to enjoy. But it would not have been possible if the gatekeepers were not really truly sensitive to the demand and challenge of what it means to be a gatekeeper of a humane and civilized institutions like this one. Thank you very much. Want to ask questions? Yes, yes.
So now, following our tradition, Professor Ahmed will be glad to take any questions.
Abdul, thank you very much. Would it be safe for you to go back to Sudan or to even go to Egypt or one of the other Middle Eastern states? He said,
Probably yes, but it is a probably I would not like to test. The thing is that I think people like me, and now I left Sudan in 1985 after very tragic events that you may be familiar with, David. And for many years I couldn't go back until 2003, when I became an American citizen, and with an American passport and a visa from the Sudan embassy, I can go to Khartoum and go register in the Ministry of Interior as a foreigner. And because I don't have a political presence in Sudan, I'm not challenging to the regime. So I've been able to go back 5 or 6 times since the early 2000s. But my worry, and really all of our worry, should be about the young men and women who are being shot at indiscriminately on the streets of Khartoum these days. Those are the people who are not safe. But they are so much unsafe in their own homes that they are willing to go out and challenge the power that intimidates them in that way. So what I mean, David, is that personally, I don't have to worry, at least if I'm being reasonable about what I say and do when I go back. And in any case, so long as I don't have a political weight that can challenge. But I also worry that in order to cultivate that level of political weight that can challenge regimes like the one we have in Sudan now, we would not stand the chance of really any of us going back to stay. And maybe I will retire in Sudan. Maybe I will be the emeritus professor in Khartoum. But for that to be possible, things have to change very, very drastically in Sudan.
Hi.
Yes, Mohammed.
I totally understand what you spoke about. Some rulers in the Middle East and North Africa use a religion to enforce their power and to make them, the rulers with religion, and you can't speak with them because you'll be like challenging religion, not challenging the ruler. And we had this in Egypt for in 2012 with the Muslim Brotherhood. But 2 days ago, I was sitting down with a couple of international students coming from Middle East and North Africa. Some of them are your student in law school. And there was a huge debate about these thoughts. How to find a common ground between human rights and Islam, like the debate area of punishment and Sharia and these stuff. How to enforce human rights without making people, Muslims, feeling that you are challenging the religion. Do you have thoughts about implementation, actual steps that we can take to implement this?
Actually, that's what precisely I have been doing for the last 40 years, I think. My website, you can link to it from my homepage at the law school website, or I can give you my card to look it up. That there is a lot of scholarship, not mine only, but many other people who have tried to present that common ground. But also let me challenge the charge in another way. Islam is the third largest religion, or maybe the second largest religion today in the world. Several billion people are Muslims. But again, to think of Islam as the Middle Eastern religion that we associate with certain types of style of dress or lifestyle is really extremely misleading. When you think that India is the second largest Muslim population in the world. Second largest. It may be now being challenged by Pakistan, but it could be India and Pakistan at that point. But the Middle East, 12% of the global population. So therefore, we should not think of Islam as Middle Eastern. And we should not think of human rights as Western. Because if human rights are Western, then they are not universal. They are just simply Western. So if you want to explain and present human rights as a Western institution, good luck. I don't think that you'll find any, including myself. But if you want to present it as a global project of humanity that we all seek to nourish and uphold jointly with our respective traditions, then by every means, by definition, that is what it is. Now, how do you do that? It is not just simply by asserting that Islam is compatible. Show me how. And again, when you say leaders who try, it's not leaders. It is the tradition itself. It goes back deep in the roots of this civilization for hundreds of years. So you have to come up, I have to come up as a Muslim advocate of human rights with a way of trying to present these values from within my own tradition, not from without. And that's where we need to look. Not by accepting or either the Western source of human rights or the Islamic nature of opposition to human rights. Neither is true.
Thank you. I have the microphone now, so Mr. Sheth. You made an interesting point about the fact that the Western nations really kind of define what human rights are and mean. And you suggest that do you have any suggestions about, from your perspective, how they might be redefined or reinterpreted or re-implemented?
Yes. I'm not suggesting that they should be redefined for everybody, because that would be the same sin that we accuse Western powers of. So it is the claim that you define human rights for global humanity. That is what is wrong. But if you look for ways in which your experience, your priorities are represented in this discourse, according to values and traditions that you accept and value, then we have a process to work with. So in other words, for example, why I say that if human rights are Western, then they are not universal, or that we should be willing to challenge the notion of formation of human rights as definitively established by the Universal Declaration, is it goes as deep as the term itself. When you say human rights, that term, right, is a liberal term. It's liberal concept. Right is a liberal concept. It is totally unknown, unaccepted for the rest of humanity. So for the fundamental, even pillar in the title itself to be so relativist, you know, all people like me who challenge sort of Western dominance and so on, were called cultural relativists, and to dismiss us. Oh, he's a cultural relativist. Now I developed my counter term. Oh, he's a Western relativist. Or, oh, he's a liberal relativist. Because to be liberal is as relative as it is to be Islamic. Liberal is not universal. Islamic is not universal. What can be universal is therefore something in between, or a hybrid of the two, but it cannot be either of the two to the exclusion of the other. So, and the reason why I find it so important to challenge the way that the term human rights is a liberal term has led to an understanding of the requirement of judicial enforcement of rights as integral to the possibility of human rights. So if a claim or an entitlement is not justiciable, that's what we were taught. It's not justiciable, meaning that it cannot be taken to court. If it is not possible to take it to court, then it is not capable of being a human right. That's why economic and social rights were rejected by Western powers, liberal Western powers, as serious human rights. I mean, they were included in the covenant, but a much weaker covenant than the civil and political rights covenant. But the point is that since their adoption in that way, they have not been taken far in terms of the method and how the discourse, the scholarship, and all of that. So my point is that the term right as a liberal relativist term affects the content of what human rights are about, and the integrity and relevance of those rights to the vast majority of humanity, which does not have the institutions and the legal structures to enforce in the same way that Western powers do. So as an African, I should be able to take African customary law seriously on its own terms, not by trying to make it mimic Western legal systems. It is not a Western legal system. It cannot be, and it need not be. So I go back and look. When I said that as a post-colonial lawyer, African lawyer, I think we betrayed our traditions, we betrayed our societies by continuing to mimic Western legal systems and ways of thinking without taking seriously the challenge of trying to come up with our own. Again, it may not be law at all. It could be something else. Sorry to take too long on this, but normativity, that's one way I do it. Normativity and legality are not synonymous. But they are probably equally, and in fact, normativity is more powerful in shaping human behavior than legality. So why do we have to go with legality when we could have something more powerful in normativity of customary law, so-called, in our societies in Africa?
I'm a Kantian, so that's a very Kantian point you're making.
Okay.
Moral law versus the legal.
With all due respect, I respect Kant and I appreciate Kantian philosophy, but it is not for me. I may shock you to put it this way. I don't think that I count.
No, I'm only saying that the distinction makes sense to me.
Yes,
and when it comes to Kant, I'm not completely.
Okay.
I'm more interested in his epistemology and his aesthetics.
Yes. No, I think in that case we are in agreement. So basically I'm talking about the possibility of upholding universal human rights through indigenous values and institutions, which may not correspond to liberal values and institutions, but they are as universal as the liberal claim is. But I think we are in agreement. Thank you.
Okay, I have two questions. One has to do with the, what do you think of the Aga Khan branch of Islam, which has been able to manage the traditions with a contemporary life? You believe in the faith, you believe in the rituals even, but at the same time you are very modern. In many ways, the Amish community comes in my mind, which is struggling. How do I stay to my norms established by the community or by the faith, and at the same time be contemporary, you know?
Yes.
And debates are going on in the Amish communities in Pennsylvania, Illinois, when I visit there, I find they are struggling with the same issue.
Yes.
So just to comment on Aga Khan movement itself, how you feel, is it doing a good job in transitioning young people, especially in terms of staying Muslim, but at the same time finding something that they relate to? Second question seems to be much more like we are all struggling all over the world, whether the institutions' rights, if you want to put that, are now being compromised by individual rights. Always has been the debate, is individual above the institution, or is the institution above the individual? Whether it's a professor in the classroom, or a judge in the court who represents an institution, or is the individual student in the classroom, or the defendant or the plaintiff in the court of law? I think that's a key debate.
Yeah.
Do you see that worldwide issue rather than an Islam issue?
On the Aga Khan side of your comment or question, I am intrigued by the Aga Khan experience and global community as a way in almost like a community without territory. Yes. And that he, in his charisma and his extremely powerful skills, have managed to hold this community together globally without territorial presence, and to exercise diplomacy in order to protect his own community. But also I understand that the Ismaili community of Aga Khan has been a minority among even the Shia of Islam, who are a minority, for decades and for 115 years of Muslim history. Therefore, it is not an experience that can be replicated by other Muslims. So I respect and support what the Aga Khan is doing for his community, but I understand that it is not something that I can expect to be replicated by other Muslims who are not of that particular community. On the question of institutions and individuals, actually to me, the individual is the only entity that is capable of holding rights and entitlements and claims. That even institutions that we talk of are in fact dependent on their individual members for their very existence. Institutions are incapable of holding rights because they are not entities. They cannot believe. So we say, when we say the Muslim community, what we mean is that it's a community of Muslims, not a community that itself is a Muslim. Because Islam is a religion that is held in the hearts and minds of believers. And communities are not that or capable of that. But communities are essential for the very survival of individuals. Absolutely. And that we should not disrespect institutions. In fact, we cannot survive without them. But we should not also uphold them to the degree that can override the integrity of the individual human being, who is, you mentioned Kant, but I would say that Ibn Rushd, for example, the Muslim scholar who lived in 1200 years, about 13th century or 12th century, maintained that the individual person is the ultimate object of the universe. And that humanity and that integrity of the individual is really the basis of all philosophy, of all social experiences, and so on. So it is, well, that's what I said, that's why I looked for you. I agree, I'm saying that, that's why I looked to say that, as Kant said, but I would say, as Ibn Rushd said, Kant said this. You know, if we really had the right order of things, we would mention the older tradition as the source of the new tradition. So every time that I speak, people remind me that I sound so Protestant, some people say. And they give me that as a compliment.
I just want to add the biggest institution that's struggling with this issue to me is neither religion nor government, but it's the family unit. By birth, the family unit is struggling, whether the individual is above the family or is a part of the family. That's what I was reading up to.
Yes.
How far have we gone, and how will the family react? Are the family going to be abolished as a unit, defined by law as a marriage, for example? Or define how we define it, or it adapts to a change. The family is redefined in many ways, and religion is the same, and government is the same. And that's the question I'm doing.
I respect and I appreciate that question, and to me it is still the individual who is behind all of this. So it is individual members of the family who can assert the integrity of the family as an institution for the protection of every member of that community. So in other words, my point is that no change can be brought about without individuals acting and struggling for it. So you cannot expect the judiciary to be an institution capable of action. It is the when you said a judge representing the judiciary, yes, but the judiciary does not stand without a judge representing it. And a judge is an individual. So therefore, I think the individual is really paramount in our social organization and political organization. But still, I mean, I'm not discounting the fundamental importance of community, but or family, or social relationships that create these institutions, but I'm just simply saying that it is an individual everywhere. And if I could reach that individual, I can make all the change I need to make.
Hello. I was wondering if you could comment on South Sudan. So you want to get rid of Bashir, but how, in your opinion, is Sudan involved in the troubles in South Sudan? And if he was to get overthrown, would things be different?
I take it that we are all familiar with Sudan and South Sudan. If not, I can take a couple of words about it. But the point is that Sudan was involved in the troubles of South Sudan for decades, but not for the last 6-7 years. Not for the last 6-7 years. And recently, actually, because of the demonstrations and the shootings that are going on in Khartoum, South Sudanese have been praying for the North. And they communicated that. So I see South Sudan and Sudan as post-colonial experiences. That South Sudan was colonized by Northern Sudan due to British policies, which ultimately, as I'm not absolving Northern Sudanese of responsibility, I'm just simply noting the colonial roots of the issue. But it was a colonial situation. And it has been resolved by self-determination by the people of that part of the world. South Sudan is an independent, sovereign state, member of the United Nations, and that is established fact. No thanks to Northern Sudan for that. But I also see a broader history for all African regions. That our experiences have been such that as individual nations, we have not been able to galvanize and mobilize our resources to achieve what we need in terms of development and stability and political institutions that we need to establish. So actually, my own work, I try to promote the idea of regional integrations across Africa as a means to a broader collaborative experience in which African communities can be interdependent as they have been in the pre-colonial. Africa is the oldest. There are human beings on the African continent before they have been anywhere else. And for those thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, those African peoples had their institutions, had their trade, their exchanges, their cultural and foreign quote-unquote relations. So it is not for lack of experience. It is lack of confidence in the value of what we have. That is part of the challenge, as I said, to post-colonial African lawyers and African political scientists and African sociologists, that we should not just simply settle for, now South Sudan is independent, okay, we are done with that. Well, who's next? That is not the way to go. The way to go is that there have been a fundamental injustice in the relationship between North and South Sudan, ending in separation of the South. Let that be. But we need to look beyond that into possibilities of integration and collaboration among regions. ECOWAS in West Africa is a possibility of that. The Union of East African States, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, is part of that possibility. So you have these regional integrations that can create more viable economic and political units, across, not units, but entities, I mean, across the continent. Sorry about my...